When it actually comes to lubricating and greasing up your regulator, if you've just manufactured yourself one or you're servicing one, there's a very big difference between what you should do with a conventional coil spring regulator and one with Belleville washers in it. So please watch both parts, and if you've got one with the Belleville washers, do what it says in that part of the video, and certainly not what I'm going to say about the conventional coil compression spring. Now, with the conventional coil compression spring, it's fairly easy to lubricate up. There's nothing special or fancy to do. Just make sure that all the surfaces have got a nice smear of the silicone grease all over them, and the same with the spring. You can put quite a bit on, as you can see. I wonder if that'll focus, as you can see here. If you do put far too much on, that will have an adverse effect, but over time the regulator should settle down because the over greasing will force its way out of the breathe hole. But just put a nice layer on like is shown here. Now, I'd rub this on with your fingers, or if you're wearing surgical gloves like I am, do that. In the past I thought, well, you could paint it on to get it on all the areas nice and evenly with a paintbrush or something like that, but you tend to find that the grease is quite tacky and you'll end up with a paintbrush hair or something inside the regulator, and this can lead to a leak. So you best just rub it on with clean fingers. So just make sure that it's all well lubricated. Try to avoid getting lots of grease down the centre hole, because obviously that's going to blast out and could cause adverse problems with the outlet valve over time. So just make sure that the hole's clear through the middle, but the rest of it's just had a light smearing all over. The same with the bore of the regulator. You can put a little bit of grease on your little finger and push that down and rub that round. That's quite simple. Now, the only thing where you've got to be careful with one of our regulators is if you get the stem seal, rub that well with the lubricant so that's covered, and then carefully drop it down the back as cleanly as you can, because the part you don't want to lubricate, the thread on the adjuster screw, because the dryness of the thread onto the piece of rubber locking material helps hold that tightly into place to stop it moving. So that's the part that you really don't need to get any lubricant on, so try and avoid doing that. And as we'd have said in the video on filters, if you've not watched that, it can be an idea to put a bit of silicone grease, just smear it around the back air intake hole, and that acts as a bit of a filter, so that if there's any dirt or little bits of chipped off rubber O-ring from your filler probe floating around inside your air reservoir, then if you've got a piece of silicone grease and just put this round the back, then hopefully that will end up getting stuck onto the grease and won't get sucked through the regulator towards the outlet valve. So in general, fairly simple. Just make sure that all the internal surfaces have got a light smearing of grease, apart from the adjuster screw and the adjuster screw thread at the tail of the body case, and then make sure that when you put it into the air reservoir cylinder, you've given the outside case and the O-rings a good wipe with some of the silicone grease. And that's about that for that. If you're someone who's got a regulator that contains the Belleville spring washers as opposed to the conventional coil compression spring, there is one real main difference in the lubrication process. So first we'll just talk about what parts of the process are generally the same. So what's going to be the same is, with the body case of the regulator, as before, lubricate the body case O-rings well before you insert it into the reservoir, and lubricate the inside of the reservoir. Apply some silicone grease around the air intake hole if you wish, so as to pick up any dirt and grime that might be floating around in the air reservoir. Inside the piston bore, rub some silicone grease again in there, just a light amount. And things to avoid are, when you've lubricated the piston stem seal, then carefully put it into the back tail of the regulator body case, trying to avoid getting grease into the adjuster screw thread, or also try to make sure that the thread on the adjuster screw itself is dry when you put it in. So that's what's the same and what you can continue to do. Now what's different is, the big difference is, with the Belleville spring washers, if you watch the other videos on a comparison between the Belleville springs and a conventional coil spring, these are in essence a cone shaped washer, and so they're sort of bowed in a stack, and the stack bow closes up and down when the regulator works. Now when it comes to lubricating these, you might think to yourself, oh, I know what I'll do, I'll put plenty of grease on, get a nice smear of the grease, put it all round the Bellevilles and put them together in a stack, and think that you've lubricated it very well. Indeed you have lubricated it very well, but you've unfortunately majorly stopped it working correctly and efficiently, because in here there's a small cavity, and now you've filled it with grease. The grease isn't going to really want to go anywhere once the piston stems through the centre hole, and so effectively it'd be like you filling both your hands with thick grease, cupping them together and then trying to press them together. The grease will squirt out through your fingers, but you know, when there's no grease in there, you can do that quite easily. If you packed your hands full of grease, that's going to be a lot more difficult. And it's the same with Belleville spring washers. So you mustn't under any circumstances go smearing your Belleville washers with lots of silicone grease. This is going to have an adverse and negative effect. What you can do with them, which is might be a little bit of a help, but is make sure that they're well cleaned. You can give them a light rub over with some very fine wet and dry, and then with the light silicone oil that we looked at earlier, if you just get a little drip of that on your finger and you rub that over the Belleville spring washer itself, so it's just got a very fine, very thin coating on it, and then assemble them like that. So you just want some very thin silicone oil and a very light smear just over the surface. Under no circumstances go lathering on the silicone grease, and that's the same for the outside of the stack as well. Don't go getting a lot on your finger and thinking, oh, I know what I'll do, I'll lubricate this up really well, I've done a fantastic job. Because unlike with the conventional coil spring, when this regulator compresses, it's got a lot harder for that grease to get out of the breathe hole, because of the washers are in a stack with concentric grooves, and there should be a very good fit against the body case as well. So doing that is going to be a disaster. So lightly lubricate the inside of the piston bore, you know, put some in there and rub that round. Lightly lubricate the piston O-ring, but with the actual Belleville washers themselves, either leave them completely dry, don't lubricate them, or if you are going to lubricate them, use some very thin oil and just rub it between your fingers, and if there's any excess on there, just wipe that off. So that's the main difference between lubricating the regulator with the Belleville washers and the conventional coil spring. The conventional coil spring you can put quite a lot of grease on, and it shouldn't really have any adverse effect, especially once the regulator's been used a little bit. But with the Belleville washers, don't go wiping lots of grease on in and around the Belleville stack, because that won't have a positive effect.